Hi everyone, this is Ms. Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our topic 6.6 and 6.7, which is all about nuclear power as well as biomass. And just warning you guys, this is going to be a little bit of a longer video than normal just because it's a lot of material. But remember, we do still have to keep up our pace if we want to ensure that we get through everything so we have enough time to prepare in May. So here we go. So big takeaways with 6.6 and discussing nuclear power is how do we actually generate electricity using nuclear power? Well, the resource that we use in order to do this is uranium-235, which is a radioactive element, and we generate that energy via fission or nuclear fission. Now, what does nuclear fission entail? Well, typically a neutron is going to be fired into the nucleus of our radioactive unstable element, uranium-235. And what that does is it breaks apart, and that's going to release tremendous amounts of energy in the form of heat. And what that also creates is then more neutrons actually break apart more nuclei, releasing more energy, causing a chain reaction. Now, we harness this energy very similarly to how we do it in a coal power plant or with natural gas. And if you want to watch the portion of Mrs. Schert's video where she explains this, you can, but you're not required to. But the big takeaway here is typically we see that that heat energy that gets released due to nuclear fission is going to heat up water, turn it into water vapor or steam. That steam is then going to turn a turbine. That mechanical energy that's generated is going to power our generator, and that generator is going to produce electricity that's then transmitted throughout a town or a city. Now, some other pieces involved in this are three things. That is the control rods, the water pump, and cooling tower. Now, because we're dealing with something that creates tremendous amounts of heat energy, we need something in order to control it and cool it down. So our control rods are actually lowered into the reactor core in order to absorb neutrons and slow down the reaction, which helps to prevent meltdowns. The water pump and cooling tower is how we bring the water that's supposed to be turned into water vapor, as well as used for overheating. And the cooling tower is what's going to allow that steam from the turbine to condense back into liquid to then be continuously reused to be turned back into vapor. So you'll see there's a couple different elements here. Just because we're working with something that generates a lot of heat energy, we need to ensure that it cools down and prevents a meltdown. Now, some consequences of nuclear energy. Now, it is a non-renewable resource. However, it is a clean energy source. It doesn't produce any air pollutants, but there are certainly other consequences to it besides that. One being the spent fuel rods. So the fuel rods is typically where we're going to house a lot of the uranium-235, and that's a radioactive element that can take millions of years to become unradioactive. And so we need to store it in either lead containers that are off-site or potentially in other areas that may not be habited. We see mine tailings. What that is, that's just leftover rock and soil from the mining of our radioactive element that can contaminate water or soil. We know that water is used in this process to cool things down and to produce steam. And so we see a lot of water use occurring here. So we can deplete the local surface and groundwater sources. And thermal pollution is another form of pollution that's a really big issue with nuclear energy. That hot water that's going to come from our nuclear power plant is going to be released actually back into surface waters, and it can potentially cause thermal shock to the surrounding organisms that live there. The other piece to this is with the increasing in temperature, that water is not going to be able to hold on to oxygen as well. So it's going to decrease dissolved oxygen levels and potentially suffocate the organisms that live there. Now, another huge consequence of nuclear power is meltdowns. Now, with a meltdown, we can see the fallout being genetic mutations of the surrounding populations, people, animals, maybe even plants. It can contaminate soil, and also that radiation can spread via wind. So it can actually be carried over long distances, affecting areas that are not even near the meltdown site. Now, some examples of nuclear meltdowns and tragedies that you do need to be familiar with this class is number one being 3 Mile Island that was found in Pennsylvania. It was first established back in the 60s, 70s, but there was a serious reactor accident in this nuclear power plant back in 1979. About 50% or so of the meltdown of the reactor core occurred. Now, there were no deaths, there was no substantial environmental damage, but what happened is that then the public eye of nuclear power, people began to really distrust it. Even though it was a source of energy that didn't produce any pollutants, people began to become afraid of nuclear power at this point. So it kind of led to the cancellation of a lot of power plants in the US. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with Chernobyl, Ukraine. This was the worst accident in history to date. Back in 1986, we saw that the nuclear reactor was completely destroyed and exploded. There were large amounts of radiation that escaped into the atmosphere and the surrounding areas. It spread across large areas of Europe, and around 10,000 or so people died. Now, a more recent nuclear meltdown that occurred was back in March of 2011, specifically in Japan. We see in the Fukushima reactors, there was an accident due to the major earthquake as well as tsunami that occurred in the surrounding area. And so what that did was it brought a lot of that radiation from the explosion into nearby surrounding areas, and it was carried by a lot of the water that was exposed from the tsunami. And in this area now is incredibly inhabitable. You can't really go into this area of Japan as of right now. Now, another piece to nuclear power that we do need to be familiar with, and you might even see some math problems on the exam involving this topic, is half-life. Now, we know radioactive substances over a certain given time are going to then become not radioactive. They're going to decay. They're going to break down. And so a radioactive half-life is the amount of time it takes for about half of that substance to decay. So here in our example, we've got half-life of cobalt-60, which is an isotope, takes about 5.27 years. So in that given time, half of that cobalt-60 sample is going to be gone. It will be decayed. And so that's what makes nuclear power so frightening to people. Right, we know that it can cause potential meltdowns, and the storage of it all can be potentially dangerous. Half-lives can take upwards of hundreds, thousands, sometimes even millions of years, depending upon the substance. All right, guys, so here's a practice FRQ for this topic. Here you'll see this is a diagram of a nuclear power plant. And in our question here, it says, identify and describe the function of any 3 parts labeled on the diagram of our water-cooled nuclear power plant shown above. So if you want to pause the video at this point and answer your practice FRQ, please do so. Okay, at this point, you should have paused the video, and let's check our answers here. Okay, so these are any things that would have been accepted in terms of correct answers. Remember, you had to identify at least 3 pieces here. So here in the first part, this is your ID. So you want to double check your answers there. And then here are functions in the order in which you see them up here. So you want to make sure that your identification matches here and your function or description matches the parts that you see here. Okay, moving on, guys. This is now topic 6.7. Now, this is going to be specifically energy from biomass. So this kind of encompasses a couple different things. Now, biomass we know is typically any type of organic matter. We've talked a little bit about this already in that lots of developing countries use biomass as their source of energy because they like to burn things like peat, charcoal, and wood, but there are other forms of biomass that we can burn as well. And so the burning of biomass we know produces heat energy, typically at a relatively low cost, but it's going to produce things like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, particulates, and volatile organic compounds. And those guys are all air pollutants that you 100% need to be familiar with, especially when we move on to Unit 7. And we know the harvesting of those then fuel sources can cause deforestation. Now, another form of biomass we talked a little bit about, especially in our modeling combustion, is what's known as ethanol. Now, ethanol can be used as a substitute for gasoline. And if you guys have ever gone to a gas station and you kind of take a look at the gas pump, you'll sometimes see maybe 10% ethanol. That's something that they can add to gasoline in order to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and kind of acts as like a substitute. So the burning of ethanol, we know, does not really introduce any additional carbon into the atmosphere, but the energy return on energy investment for ethanol, unfortunately, is quite low. And we kind of found that out in our modeling combustion lab when we had to do the ratio at the very end. Right, we saw that it didn't really produce as much energy as compared to how much CO2 it may produce, versus methane, which produces more energy via the amount of CO2 it produces. So diving a little more into our ethanol production and potentially solution. So remember, we know ethanol is a substitute for gasoline, but how do we make it? So we actually take ethanol from corn and sugarcane, and that's going to be fermented by yeast and eventually turned into ethanol and mixed with gasoline. Now, some environmental consequences of using ethanol is simply how we get that corn, how we get that sugar. Oftentimes, it's from monocropping agriculture practices, and we know monocropping can create loss of biodiversity. We know simply just having that area of land creates habitat loss, maybe even soil erosion. We know it increases greenhouse gases because the tractors and the machineries we use fossil fuels, as well as water use. So what is the alternative to that? Well, lots of scientists now are studying if we can actually get energy from algae. So algae is another type of biofuel that's kind of like an up and coming study. And actually algae produces oils that can be used as biofuels, and it's more sustainable than our corn. Now, another alternative biofuel besides ethanol algae is what's known as biodiesel. So these are liquid fuels that are produced specifically from plant oils, so things like soy, canola, palm oil. Lots of palm oil. Biodiesel has actually been found to produce about 98% more greenhouse gases than fossil fuels due to the clearing of forests for palm plantations. But it can be more sustainable if already cleared land is used. So if we don't have to just clear a forest in order to then plant all of this palm oil, if it's already cleared, it could potentially be more sustainable. And guys, just some pros and cons of biomass as an energy source that we need to be familiar with. We know in terms of pros, it can potentially be a renewable resource. The carbon cycle can help to reduce the buildup of greenhouse gases. And it has some domestic benefits too. We know it can create jobs. It can strengthen, say, rural economies that might depend upon it more. But the cons, we know that it's not as energy dense as our fossil fuels or, say, nuclear power. Has a high water content, because remember, if we're taking it from crops, all of those crops require water in order to survive. And the commercial use, right? We know that biomass produces feedstock, availability and cost can change. There's a lot of moving parts to biomass. All right, so guys, take a second and pause the video at this point and see if you can answer a practice multiple choice question. All right, guys, at this point, you should have paused the video and let's see if our answer is correct. So in the majority of less developed countries, the major source of energy for domestic use is which of the following? Remember, that would be biomass. All right, guys, I know this was quite a long video, but make sure as you watch the video, you took notes and please mark this as done.